Shut up, or I'll make you. Ethan Whitmore whispered, his voice low enough to sound almost polite, yet sharp enough to slice through the soft jazz drifting across the restaurant. And in that single moment, the entire table seemed to shrink around Amara Johnson, as though the air itself had learned to pull away from her. Her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the white linen tablecloth while the flicker of candlelight trembled in the reflection of her glass. She didn't look up. She never did when his tone dropped like that. Because looking up meant meeting eyes that didn't see her as a person, but as something smaller, something to correct, something to control, and still the words echoed louder than the music, louder than the clinking of silverware. Louder than the polite conversations floating from table to table in that upscale Manhattan dining room, where the cheapest entree cost more than what her mother once earned in a full day. I said stop talking, he added, leaning just slightly closer, not enough to cause a scene, never enough to break the illusion of refinement he wore like a tailored suit, but enough for her to feel it, the pressure, the expectation, the quiet warning wrapped in civility, and around them a few glances flickered, quick and cautious, strangers sensing something was off but unwilling to interfere, because this was not their story. This was just another uncomfortable moment at a table they would soon forget, but Amara could not forget. She lived inside these moments, collected them like invisible bruises no one else could see. Her voice caught somewhere between her chest and her throat, fragile, restrained. I'm just trying to, she began, barely above a breath. And that was enough to make Ethan's jaw tighten in a way only she seemed to notice. You're trying too much, he replied, his smile still in place for anyone watching, polished, controlled, respectable, the kind of smile that earned approval in boardrooms and charity galas, the kind that hid everything beneath it, and for a second her eyes lifted, not in defiance but in something quieter, something closer to exhaustion, because it wasn't the words anymore, it was the pattern. The way every conversation bent back toward silence, toward obedience, toward making herself smaller so he could remain larger, and across the room a waiter paused mid-step before continuing on, as if instinct told him not to linger, as if even service had its boundaries, and still the world kept moving, glasses lifted, laughter resumed, the pianist's fingers brushing the keys in soft repetition. Everything continued as though nothing was happening, as though a woman wasn't being slowly erased in plain sight, and at the table just behind them, a man in a dark suit sat perfectly still, his presence unnoticed by most, his posture relaxed but deliberate, one hand resting lightly against the stem of a wine glass he hadn't touched, his gaze not obvious, not intrusive, but precise, like someone who had learned to see without being seen. Sebastian Vercelli had entered the restaurant 20 minutes earlier without announcement, without attention, the kind of man who didn't need either, and at first he hadn't been paying attention. Not really. Conversations like this existed everywhere, quiet imbalances hidden beneath polished surfaces, but something in the tone, something in the rhythm of that single sentence, had shifted his focus, and now he listened without turning, without moving, because men like him didn't react quickly, they observed, they measured, they understood before they acted. And back at the table Ethan leaned back slightly, satisfied with the silence he had created, lifting his glass as though nothing had happened, as though control was just another course in the evening, while Amara's hands loosened their grip, her shoulders settling into stillness, the kind of stillness that came not from peace but from practice, from knowing when resistance would only make things worse. And for a brief second she allowed herself to breathe, slow, careful, unnoticed, because survival in moments like this wasn't about winning. It was about enduring, about choosing the exact second to speak or not speak, to exist without drawing fire. And still, somewhere deep beneath that practiced calm, something flickered, not anger, not even hope, just a quiet question she hadn't dared to ask in a long time. How much smaller could she become before she disappeared entirely? And behind her the man in black finally lifted his glass, not to drink, but to pause, his fingers tightening just slightly, as though something unseen had shifted, his attention no longer casual, no longer distant, but fixed, and though no one at that table realized it yet, the silence Ethan had just claimed was not his to control anymore. The silence did not break, it stretched, thin and fragile, like glass moments before it shatters, and Amara felt it settle over the table with a weight she could not quite explain. Heavier than Ethan's words, heavier than the quiet humiliation that had already carved its place into the evening. Because this silence was different. This one was not his, not entirely. And somewhere behind her a chair shifted with a softness that should have gone unnoticed, yet did not, because even the air seemed to listen now. Ethan lifted his glass again, taking a slow sip as if reclaiming control required nothing more than patience, as if the world always returned to him when he waited long enough, his gaze sliding over Amara with that same practiced calm, the same quiet dismissal that had followed her through months of dinners, conversations, and carefully managed appearances. "You always do this," he said, his tone measured, almost conversational, but edged with something colder beneath. "You make things uncomfortable." And the words landed softly, too softly for anyone else to react, but loud enough to echo inside her chest, because discomfort, she had learned, was often just another word for truth spoken in the wrong place, at the wrong time, by the wrong person. Her fingers moved again, this time not tightening but releasing, letting go of the tablecloth as if even that small grip had become too much. Her shoulders straightening just slightly, not in defiance, not yet, but in something closer to remembering that she still occupied space, even here, even now. And Ethan noticed, of course he did, his eyes narrowing by the smallest fraction, the kind of shift only someone who watched her closely would ever catch. "Look at me when I am talking to you," he added, still quiet, still controlled, but sharper now, a command wrapped in civility. And slowly, carefully, she did, her gaze lifting to meet his, not challenging, not soft, simply present. And for a brief second something flickered between them, something unspoken, something neither of them fully understood, because presence, real presence, had a way of unsettling people who expected obedience. And across the room the pianist faltered for half a beat before continuing, the melody dipping, then recovering as though even the music had felt the shift. And behind them the man in black set his glass down without drinking. The soft click of crystal against wood nearly lost beneath the ambient sound, yet it carried, it traveled, it marked a change that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with intention. Sebastian Vercelli did not move immediately. He did not need to. His presence was already expanding, filling the invisible space between moments, between breaths, his gaze fixed now not just on the table before him, but on the dynamic unfolding just feet away. And what he saw was not unusual, not entirely. Power misused was a language he understood fluently. But there was something else here, something quieter, something in the way the woman held herself despite everything. Not broken, not pleading, simply enduring. And endurance, he knew, was not weakness. It was a form of strength most people failed to recognize until it was too late. "There it is," Ethan murmured, almost to himself, as if her eye contact had confirmed something he already believed. "That look," he added, leaning forward again, elbows resting lightly on the table, his voice dropping just enough to create intimacy where none existed. "You think you are better than this, do not you?" And the question hung there, not seeking an answer, only reinforcing a narrative he had already decided was true. And Amara felt the familiar pull to retreat, to soften, to dissolve the moment before it escalated further. But something held her in place, something small and steady that refused to disappear this time. Her lips parted slightly, not to argue, not to defend, just to speak. "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear, unmistakably clear. "I just think I deserve to be heard." And it was not a declaration, not a confrontation, just a statement, simple and unadorned, yet it landed harder than anything louder ever could, because truth did not need volume to disrupt, it only needed presence. And for the first time that evening Ethan's composure shifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough, a tightening around his eyes, a pause that lasted just a second too long. And behind them a voice, calm and precise, entered the space without asking permission. "She does," it said, low, even, controlled, and everything stopped, not abruptly, not loudly, but completely, as if the entire room had taken a breath and forgotten how to release it. Ethan turned slowly, irritation already forming before recognition had a chance to follow. His expression prepared for dismissal, for correction, for reclaiming authority, but the moment his eyes landed on the man standing just behind Amara's chair, that expression faltered, not disappearing, but shifting, recalculating, because something in that presence did not align with expectation. Sebastian did not raise his voice, did not step closer than necessary, did not display anything resembling aggression, yet there was weight in the way he stood, in the stillness he carried, in the certainty that did not need to announce itself. "Excuse me," Ethan began, the edge returning to his tone as he attempted to reassert control. "This is a private conversation." But the words lacked their usual precision, their usual certainty, because something underneath them had already begun to fracture, and Sebastian's gaze did not leave his, steady, unblinking, assessing. "Not anymore," he replied, just as quietly, just as controlled, and for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. No one moved. No one spoke, the balance of the room tilting ever so slightly, as if something invisible had shifted its center, and Amara, still seated, still silent, felt it, not as relief, not yet, but as possibility, fragile and unfamiliar, something she had not allowed herself to consider in a long time. Because sometimes the most dangerous change was not loud, not sudden, but quiet, the kind that arrived in a single sentence and altered everything that came after. The word did not echo, it settled, heavy and deliberate, and Ethan felt it before he fully understood it, a shift that did not belong to him, something that had entered the space and quietly rewritten the rules. His posture remained upright, controlled, but the ease he had carried just moments ago began to thin, like a smile held too long. "I think you misunderstand," he said, slower now, choosing each word with care, because control was something he had built his entire identity around, and losing it, even slightly, was not an option he recognized. "This is between my wife and me," he added, emphasizing the last word as if ownership could still anchor the moment back in his favor, and for a second the room seemed to lean toward that statement, toward the familiar structure of authority and relationship, but Sebastian did not move, did not acknowledge the framing. His presence remained unchanged, steady, uninterested in the boundaries Ethan was trying to draw. It stopped being private when respect left the table. He replied, his voice calm, almost reflective, yet there was something final in it, something that did not invite negotiation, and Amara felt the words land differently, not sharp, not cutting, but grounding, as if someone had named something she had only ever felt, never said. And for the first time that evening her breathing shifted, not entirely free, but less restricted, less confined by the invisible pressure that had surrounded her. Ethan let out a quiet laugh, the kind meant to dismiss, to reduce, to re-establish distance between himself and whatever challenge had just appeared. "Respect," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the word, then shook his head slightly. "You do not know anything about our relationship." And there it was again, the attempt to reclaim narrative, to define reality in a way that excluded anyone else from questioning it. And Sebastian's gaze did not waver, not even for a moment, because men like him did not need full stories to recognize patterns. "I know enough," he said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it refused to engage in the game Ethan was trying to play. It refused to argue, to justify, to defend. It simply existed as truth, and that, more than anything, unsettled Ethan. His fingers tightened slightly around the stem of his glass, a subtle movement, but one that betrayed the shift happening beneath his composed exterior, because control was no longer flowing in one direction, and he could feel it, even if he refused to acknowledge it fully. "Look," he began again, this time softer, more measured, recalibrating. "I appreciate your concern, but it is unnecessary." And there was a hint of politeness now, a strategic adjustment, because confrontation without dominance required a different approach, one he was less comfortable navigating. And behind him a couple at another table fell silent mid-conversation, their attention drawn not by volume, but by tension, the kind that hummed beneath the surface and made everything else feel secondary. Sebastian finally moved then, not forward, not aggressively, but just enough to shift the dynamic completely, his hand resting lightly against the back of Amara's chair, not touching her, not claiming space over her, but creating a boundary that had not existed before, and that small, deliberate gesture changed everything, because it redefined the space. It said without words that she was no longer alone at that table, that the imbalance had been seen, acknowledged, interrupted, and Amara felt it before she understood it. The subtle difference between being exposed and being protected, not in a possessive way, not in a controlling way, but in something steadier, something that allowed her to sit a little straighter without fear of immediate correction. Ethan saw it too. Of course he did, his eyes flickering briefly to the placement of that hand, then back to Sebastian's face, and something sharper surfaced beneath his controlled expression, not anger exactly, but resistance, the refusal to accept a shift he had not initiated. "You are overstepping," he said, the words quieter now, but edged with something firmer, something closer to warning. And for a moment, it almost sounded convincing, almost regained its authority, but Sebastian did not respond immediately, and that pause, that deliberate absence of reaction, stretched longer than expected, longer than comfortable, until it forced Ethan to sit inside it, to feel it, to realize that the usual cues he relied on were not being returned. And when Sebastian finally spoke, his voice was even softer than before, yet somehow more commanding. "No," he said, simply, and the single word carried a certainty that did not need to expand, did not need to explain. It existed as its own conclusion, and something in Ethan's expression shifted again, smaller this time, more internal, a recalculation that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with recognition, because power, real power, was not always loud, it was not always visible, but when it appeared, unmistakably present, it forced acknowledgement whether welcomed or not. And across the room, a server hesitated near the entrance to the dining area, unsure whether to approach or wait, because even without understanding the details, the energy had changed, the balance had tilted, and at the center of it Amara remained still, her gaze no longer fixed on the table, no longer avoiding, but observing, taking in the moment as it unfolded around her. Because for the first time in a long while she was not the only one carrying its weight, and that realization, quiet and fragile, settled somewhere deeper than fear, deeper than uncertainty. It settled in possibility, and though she did not yet know what that meant, or what would follow, she felt it. The beginning of something she had almost forgotten how to recognize, the moment when silence was no longer something forced upon her, but something she could choose, and in that choice, however small, everything began to change. The word hung between them, small yet immovable, and Ethan felt it settle in a place he could not immediately reach, a quiet disruption that refused to respond to his usual methods of control. His gaze flickered briefly toward Amara, as if expecting her to restore the balance by shrinking again, by retreating into the silence he had trained her to occupy. But she did not. She remained still, composed, her shoulders no longer curved inward, but held with a subtle steadiness that felt unfamiliar even to her, and that alone unsettled him more than the presence of the man behind her chair, because control was never just about dominance. It was about predictability, and she was no longer entirely predictable. "This is unnecessary," Ethan said again, but the words lacked their earlier sharpness, softened by something he could not quite conceal, a hesitation that stretched just a fraction too long, and Sebastian noticed it. Of course he did, because hesitation was the first sign of fracture, the first signal that certainty had begun to erode, and he did not rush to fill the space. He let it remain, let it expand, because silence, when used correctly, had a way of revealing more than questions ever could. The faint hum of the restaurant returned in fragments, a glass set down. Here, a quiet breath there, but the focus remained, drawn invisibly toward the tension at the table, and Amara felt it all, the attention, the shift, the fragile sense that something irreversible had begun. Her heart moved slower now, not racing, not panicked, just steady, as if it had found a rhythm outside of fear for the first time in a long while. And that steadiness allowed her to notice things she might have missed before. The way Sebastian's presence did not press against her, but stood beside her. The way his hand remained on the chair, not touching, not claiming, simply there. creating space rather than taking it. And that difference, subtle but profound, made something loosen inside her, something she had not realized was held so tightly. Ethan exhaled slowly, his fingers adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, a habitual movement, a return to control through detail. "I think it would be best if you returned to your table," he said, directing the statement toward Sebastian with a measured politeness that bordered on dismissal, as if this could still be resolved through etiquette, through the unspoken rules of social hierarchy he understood so well, and for a brief second it almost worked, almost restored the familiar structure of the evening. But Sebastian did not move, did not acknowledge the suggestion as something requiring response. Instead, his gaze shifted, not away, but slightly, just enough to include Amara in the moment without forcing her into it. And when he spoke again, his voice remained calm, deliberate. "I think it would be best if she decided what happens next." And the shift was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, because the focus of the conversation had changed, no longer centered on Ethan, no longer defined by his expectations, but placed, quietly and firmly, back into Amara's hands. And for a second she did not move, did not speak, because the idea of deciding, truly deciding, felt unfamiliar, almost distant, like a language she had once known but had not used in years. Her mind moved through possibilities, through outcomes, through the weight of each potential choice. And Ethan saw it, saw the hesitation, and leaned forward. Slightly, his voice lowering again, softer now, almost coaxing. "Amara," he said, her name carrying a different tone this time. Less command, more persuasion. "Let us not make a scene." And the words were carefully chosen, designed to pull her back into the role she knew. The one where maintaining peace meant sacrificing voice, where dignity was measured by how quietly she could endure. And for a moment the pull was strong, familiar, almost comforting in its predictability, but something resisted, something anchored her in place, and she realized, slowly, that the fear she had expected to feel was not as overwhelming as it once had been, that the presence behind her had changed something fundamental, not by speaking for her, but by reminding her that silence was not her only option. Her fingers rested lightly on the table now, no longer gripping, no longer trembling, just still, and she drew a breath, steady and measured, before speaking. "I am not making a scene," she said, her voice quiet, but clear, carrying just enough to be heard without effort. "I am just not staying quiet anymore." And the sentence settled into the space with a weight that surprised even her, because it did not feel like defiance. It felt like truth, simple and unadorned. And Ethan leaned back slightly, the shift subtle but real, his expression tightening in a way he could not fully conceal, because this was not the response he had anticipated, not the one he had prepared for. And for the first time that evening, he did not immediately know what to say, and that absence, that small gap in his control, changed everything. Sebastian remained still, his hand still resting against the chair, his presence unchanged. But there was something in his gaze now, something quieter, something that acknowledged the moment without taking it over, because this was no longer his intervention, it was hers. And across the room the ambient noise began to return, slowly, cautiously, as if the world was testing whether it was safe to continue. But the shift had already taken place, invisible yet irreversible, and Amara felt it settle within her, not as certainty, not as resolution, but as the beginning of something she had not allowed herself to consider before, the possibility that her voice, once spoken, could not be taken back. And that realization, quiet and steady, carried a power all its own. For a moment, no one spoke, and in that silence Ethan felt something unfamiliar settle beneath his carefully maintained composure. Not anger, not yet, but something closer to exposure, as if the structure he had relied on had shifted just enough to reveal the cracks he had spent so long hiding. His gaze remained fixed on Amara now, no longer glancing past her or through her, but directly at her, measuring, recalculating, searching for the version of her he understood, the one who would soften, who would step back, who would restore the balance he expected. But she did not. She held his gaze with a quiet steadiness that did not challenge him openly yet refused to retreat. And that alone changed the shape of the moment. "You are overreacting," he said finally, the words controlled, familiar, an attempt to reframe what had just happened into something smaller, something manageable, because if it could be reduced, it could be dismissed, and if it could be dismissed, it could be controlled again. His tone softened slightly at the edges, almost reasonable now, as if the entire exchange had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. "We are having a conversation," he continued, his voice carrying just enough warmth to suggest normalcy. "That is all this is." And for a second the words hovered, waiting to settle, waiting for her to accept them, to allow the moment to fold back into something predictable. But Amara did not respond immediately. She felt the weight of his framing, recognized it, understood how easily it could pull her back into the pattern she had lived inside for so long, where her discomfort became exaggeration, where her voice became disruption, where her truth became something to smooth over for the sake of appearances, and she almost followed it, almost let the moment pass. But something held her there, something steadier than fear, something quieter than anger, and she realized, slowly, that she no longer needed to accept his version of the moment as the only one that existed. Her breath moved through her chest, slow, deliberate, grounding, and when she spoke again, her voice did not rise, did not sharpen. It remained exactly where it had been, calm, clear, undeniable. "It does not feel like a conversation to me," she said, and the simplicity of it carried a weight that could not be easily redirected, because it was not an argument, it was not an accusation. It was a statement of experience, something that could not be negotiated away, and Ethan's expression shifted again, smaller this time, more contained, because this was the space he was least comfortable in, the one where control could not be re-established through logic or tone alone, the one where her perspective existed independently of his. And behind her Sebastian remained still, his presence unchanged, his hand still resting lightly against the back of her chair, not intervening, not guiding, simply present, allowing the moment to unfold without taking it from her. And that restraint, that deliberate absence of control, reinforced something deeper than any words could have. It reminded her that she did not need to be directed, that she was capable of holding her own ground, even here, even now. Ethan exhaled again, slower this time, his fingers releasing the glass he had been holding as if even that small point of control had become irrelevant. "You are making this into something it is not," he said, quieter now, less certain, the edges of his authority softening as the dynamic continued to shift away from him. And for the first time that evening, there was a trace of something else in his voice, something closer to unease, because the conversation was no longer following the path he had expected, no longer responding to the cues he had relied on. And that unpredictability made him pause, made him reconsider, even if only for a moment. And Amara saw it, saw the hesitation, the slight uncertainty, and something inside her settled further, not triumph, not satisfaction, just recognition. The understanding that the balance had changed in a way that could not be easily undone. She did not lean forward, did not push the moment further. She simply remained where she was, grounded, present, and that stillness spoke louder than any escalation could have. Across the room, the soft hum of conversation began to return more fully now, cautious at first, then gradually resuming its usual rhythm, as if the space itself was adjusting to the new equilibrium. But the table remained different, marked by what had just occurred, by what had been said, and what had not been taken back. Ethan's gaze shifted briefly toward Sebastian, then back to Amara, as if trying to determine where the true shift had originated, whether it was external or internal, whether it could be undone by removing one element, or if it had already taken root somewhere deeper. And that uncertainty lingered, subtle but persistent, because for the first time he was not entirely sure of his position in the moment, not entirely certain of the outcome, and that alone was enough to keep him from pushing further. His posture adjusted slightly, not retreating, but no longer pressing forward. "We can talk about this later," he said finally, the words carrying a different tone now, less command, more suggestion, as if he were attempting to move the moment out of public view, back into a space where he felt more in control. And for a second the option lingered, familiar, easy, the path she had taken so many times before. But Amara did not immediately agree, did not immediately follow. She considered it, not out of obligation, but out of choice. and that distinction mattered more than anything else. Her gaze remained steady, her voice, when it came, just as calm as before. "We can talk," she said, pausing just long enough for the next part to settle into place, "but not like this." And again, it was not a confrontation, not a rejection, just a boundary, clear and defined, something she had not allowed herself to establish before, and Ethan absorbed it, his expression tightening for a fraction of a second before smoothing again. Because even now, even in this shifted moment, he was still learning how to respond to a version of her that did not align with his expectations. And behind her, Sebastian finally lifted his hand from the back of the chair, not because his presence was no longer needed, but because the moment had changed, because the space he had created was now being held by her. And that, more than anything, was the point. He did not step away entirely, but he did step back just enough to signal that the balance now belonged to her. And Amara felt it, the subtle shift, the quiet acknowledgement that she was no longer being shielded, but supported. And that difference settled into her with a clarity she could not ignore, because for the first time in a long while, she was not simply enduring the moment, she was shaping it, even if only in small, deliberate ways. And that realization, quiet and steady, marked the beginning of something she had almost forgotten how to recognize, the moment when her voice was no longer something to hide, but something to hold. The space between them did not close, it remained open, deliberate, as if something invisible had been placed there and neither of them was willing to cross it first, and Ethan felt it, that distance, not physical but something deeper, something that had not existed before this evening. His posture remained composed, his expression controlled, but there was a shift beneath it now, a calculation that had replaced certainty, because the conversation was no longer following the path he had always relied on, no longer bending toward his expectations, and that unfamiliarity unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "Not like this," he repeated quietly, almost as if testing her words against his own understanding, and for a brief moment he said nothing more, his gaze studying her in a way it had not before, not dismissive, not corrective, but searching, as though he was trying to recognize the person sitting across from him, the one who had just drawn a line he had not anticipated. And Amara held that gaze without flinching, not because she felt stronger than him, not because the fear had disappeared entirely, but because something inside her had shifted just enough to make retreat feel more difficult than staying. Her hands rested lightly in her lap now, still, composed, no longer gripping the edge of anything for support, and that stillness carried a quiet kind of strength that did not need to announce itself. And across the table Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but heavier than before. "You are tired," he said finally, his voice softening in a way that might have sounded concerned to someone else. But to her it felt different, familiar, the kind of softness that came not from understanding but from redirection, from the need to explain her reaction in a way that minimized its meaning. "It has been a long week," he added, as if offering her an explanation she had not asked for, as if giving her a reason to step back without losing face. And for a moment the words lingered, offering an easier path, a gentler version of retreat, but Amara did not take it. She recognized it for what it was, a reframing, a way to move past the moment without addressing it. And she could feel the old instinct rise, the one that urged her to accept, to nod, to let the conversation shift into something safer, something more familiar. But that instinct did not settle this time. It hovered, uncertain, unable to fully take hold, because something else stood in its place now, something steadier, something that refused to disappear. "I am not tired," she said, her voice calm, unhurried, and the clarity of it disrupted the space again, not sharply, not aggressively, but enough to prevent the moment from closing. And Ethan's gaze tightened slightly, the smallest sign of resistance returning, because each time she refused to follow the path he laid out, the dynamic shifted further away from him, and that was something he could not easily correct, not with tone, not with logic, not with the subtle strategies he had relied on for so long. And behind her Sebastian remained still, his presence quieter now, less central, but not absent, his attention still fixed on the exchange, not intruding, not directing, simply observing, because the moment no longer required his voice, it required hers, And he understood that stepping in again would disrupt the very balance he had helped create. And so he waited, his silence deliberate, his stillness a form of restraint that carried its own kind of power, the kind that did not need to act to be felt. Ethan shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting his posture as if reclaiming physical space might help restore the control that had slipped, his fingers brushing briefly against the edge of the table before settling again. "We should leave," he said after a moment, the words measured, practical, an attempt to move the situation into a different environment, one where the variables were more familiar, where the presence behind her would no longer be a factor, and for a second the suggestion lingered, carrying the weight of expectation, of routine, of everything that had come before this moment, and Amara felt it, the pull of it, the ease of simply standing, of following, of allowing the evening to end without further disruption. But something held her in place, something quiet but firm, and she realized, slowly, that leaving now would not resolve anything. It would only return them to the same pattern, the same unspoken rules, the same silence she had just begun to step out of. And that realization settled into her with a clarity she could not ignore. Her gaze remained steady as she spoke. "I am not ready to leave," she said, and the words, simple as they were, carried a weight that shifted the moment once again, because they were not reactive, not defensive, they were a choice, clear and deliberate, and Ethan felt it immediately, the shift in direction, the refusal to follow his lead, and for a brief second something sharper flickered beneath his composed exterior, not anger exactly, but resistance, the instinct to push back, to reassert, to regain what had been lost, but it did not fully surface, it paused, held back by something he was beginning to recognize, something in the presence behind her, something in the steadiness in front of him, something that made escalation feel uncertain, unpredictable, and that uncertainty slowed him, kept him from moving forward in the way he might have before. "Amara," he said again, her name carrying a different tone now, less command, more caution, as if he was navigating unfamiliar ground, and she heard it, heard the shift, recognized it for what it was. Not control, not yet, but something closer to adjustment, to the beginning of understanding that the dynamic had changed in a way he could not immediately undo. And that recognition did not make her feel powerful. It made her feel present, fully present in a moment she would once have tried to escape, and that presence, quiet and steady, grounded her in a way she had not expected. And across the room the soft hum of the restaurant continued, conversations rising and falling, glasses clinking, life moving forward as it always did. But at the table something fundamental had shifted, something that would not easily return to what it had been. And Amara felt it settle within her, not as certainty, not as resolution, but as the beginning of something new, something fragile and untested, the understanding that her voice, once claimed, could not be easily set aside again. And that realization, quiet and unwavering, marked a turning point she could not ignore, because for the first time in a long while, she was not simply responding to the moment, she was shaping it, one choice at a time. The refusal did not raise its voice, yet it altered the room in a way no loud argument ever could, and Ethan felt it settle into place with a quiet finality that made his next breath come slower, more deliberate, as if he needed time to adjust to a version of the evening that no longer belonged entirely to him. His gaze remained fixed on Amara, searching, not for weakness this time, but for something he could still predict, something he could still guide. But what he found instead was stillness, not passive, not withdrawn, but anchored, the kind of stillness that did not ask permission to exist, and that unsettled him more than any raised voice ever could. "You are being unreasonable," he said, though the words lacked conviction, as if even he was aware they did not fully apply anymore, because reason, in the way he had always defined it, depended on her compliance, on her willingness to align with his version of events, and that alignment was no longer guaranteed. Amara did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of choice, because she was no longer reacting, she was deciding, and that difference, subtle but powerful, changed the rhythm of everything. Her eyes did not drop, did not flicker away. They remained steady, present, and in that presence there was no challenge, no aggression, just clarity, and clarity, She was beginning to understand, was harder to dismiss than emotion. "No," she said quietly, the single word landing with more weight than the entire conversation that had come before it, and for a moment it seemed to expand, filling the space between them, removing any room for reinterpretation. Ethan leaned back. Slightly. The movement controlled but undeniable, a small retreat disguised as composure, his fingers brushing against the side of his glass before settling again, because even now he needed something tangible to hold on to, something that reminded him of structure, of order, of control, and yet that control felt thinner now, less certain, as if it could slip further with the wrong movement. "You are letting this get out of hand," he continued, his tone quieter, more measured, but there was something else beneath it now, something closer to caution, because he could feel the shift even if he did not fully understand it. And Amara heard it, heard the change, recognized it for what it was, not dominance, not confidence, but adjustment, the beginning of uncertainty, and that recognition settled into her with a quiet strength she had not expected, not because it gave her power over him, but because it reminded her that his control had never been absolute. It had only felt that way because she had never stepped outside of it before, and now she had, even if only slightly, even if only in this moment. And that was enough to change everything. "It was already out of hand," she replied, her voice steady, her words simple, and again the clarity of it disrupted the space, not aggressively, not forcefully, but enough to prevent the conversation from returning to its previous shape. And Ethan paused, truly paused this time, his expression tightening just slightly as the weight of her statement settled in, because it did not argue, it did not escalate. It simply redefined the entire situation in a way he could not easily dismiss. And behind her Sebastian remained still, his presence now more distant, not physically, but intentionally, as if he had stepped back without moving, allowing the moment to belong fully to her, his gaze still attentive, still aware, but no longer central. And that distance was deliberate, because intervention was no longer necessary, not in the same way. The balance had shifted, and it was being held by her now. Ethan exhaled again, slower this time, his shoulders relaxing just enough to suggest a different approach, because the one he had relied on was no longer working. "You are right," he said suddenly, the words unexpected, the tone carefully controlled, and for a brief moment the statement hung in the air, uncertain, as if it did not fully belong to him yet. "This is not the place for this," he added, adjusting the phrasing just enough to maintain some sense of control, to reshape the agreement into something that still aligned with his perspective. And Amara noticed it. The shift, the subtle attempt to reclaim ground through agreement, to soften the moment without fully acknowledging it. And for a second she considered it, not as surrender, but as an option, a possible path forward that did not require further confrontation, but something within her held steady, something that no longer needed to rush toward resolution, because resolution, she was beginning to understand, did not come from ending the moment quickly. It came from allowing it to exist fully, and she was not ready to let it end yet, not before it had been seen for what it was. "Then we should not pretend it did not happen," she said, her voice just as calm as before, and the words, though quiet, carried a finality that shifted the moment once again, because they removed the possibility of avoidance, of quiet dismissal, of returning to normal without acknowledgement. And Ethan felt it, the closing of that path, the narrowing of his options, and for the first time that evening there was a flicker of something he could not fully conceal, not anger, not frustration, but something closer to recognition. The understanding that the dynamic had changed in a way that could not be undone simply by waiting it out, and that realization slowed him, grounded him in a moment he could not easily escape. Across the room the soft rhythm of the restaurant continued, steady, uninterrupted, as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had, because at that table the balance had shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably, and Amara felt it settle within her, not as triumph, not as victory, but as truth, the simple, steady understanding that her voice, once spoken, could not be unheard, and that realization, quiet and unwavering, marked a point she could not return from, because for the first time she was not simply part of the moment, she was shaping it, and that, more than anything, changed what came next. The words did not fade. They remained, suspended between them with a weight that neither could ignore, and Ethan felt the narrowing of space in a way he had not anticipated, as if each option he once relied on had quietly closed without his permission. His gaze lingered on Amara, not with the certainty he had carried before, but with something more restrained, more cautious, because he was beginning to understand that this was no longer a moment he could guide back into familiarity, and that realization settled into him with an unfamiliar stillness. "You want acknowledgement," he said after a pause, his voice lower now, not dismissive, not entirely defensive, but measured, as if he was testing the shape of the situation from a different angle. And Amara did not respond immediately, not because she doubted his words, but because she recognized the shift within them, the attempt to define the moment on his terms again, to reframe her clarity into something he could interpret, manage, control. Her breath moved slowly, steady, her posture unchanged, because she no longer felt the need to fill the silence quickly. She no longer needed to respond before she understood what was being offered, and that patience, that deliberate pause, changed the rhythm of the conversation once more. Ethan continued, his tone adjusting subtly. "Fine," he added, a single word that might have sounded like agreement to someone else, but to her it felt incomplete, unfinished, like a door opened just enough to suggest movement, but not enough to allow it. "If that is what you need, then we can talk about it later." And again, there it was, the familiar redirection, the movement away from the present, toward a future moment that would likely never carry the same weight, the same clarity, the same truth. And Amara felt it clearly now. The pattern, the repetition, the way resolution was always delayed until it could be reshaped into something less disruptive, less real. And for the first time she did not feel pulled toward it. She saw it, understood it, and chose differently. "I do not need later," she said quietly, her voice steady, grounded, and the words landed with a calm certainty that shifted the space again. Because they removed the safety of postponement, they held the moment exactly where it was, in its full weight, in its full truth. And Ethan's expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because he could feel the narrowing of control, the absence of the usual escape routes. And for a brief second, something almost like respect flickered beneath the surface, quickly hidden, quickly replaced, but present nonetheless. Sebastian remained behind her, silent, still, his presence no longer intervening but not withdrawn, a quiet constant that had altered the balance and now allowed it to stabilize on its own. His gaze moved between them with a calm attentiveness, not judging, not intruding, simply observing, because what mattered now was not his voice, but hers, the way she held the moment, the way she chose to remain within it, and that choice carried more weight than anything he could have said. Ethan shifted again, his hand moving to adjust his cuff before falling still, a small gesture that spoke of habit, of control, of the need to return to something familiar, but even that felt less effective now, less grounding. "You are asking for something complicated," he said, his tone quieter, less certain, as if he was navigating unfamiliar territory. And Amara heard it, heard the shift in his voice, the subtle movement away from authority towards something else, something closer to uncertainty. And she did not rush to correct him, did not raise her voice. She simply responded with the same calm clarity that had carried her this far. "No," she said, and again the simplicity of it disrupted the space. "I am asking for something simple," she continued, her words measured, deliberate. "To be treated like I matter." And the sentence settled into the air with a quiet finality that could not be easily dismissed, because it did not accuse, did not demand. It simply stated a truth so basic it should not have needed to be said at all. And yet here it was, undeniable, present, and Ethan felt it, felt the weight of it in a way that left him momentarily without response. Because this was not a conflict he could win through logic, not a situation he could resolve through tone. It required something else, something he had not yet decided he was willing to give, and that hesitation held him in place. Across the room the soft murmur of conversation continued, glasses lifted, chairs shifted, life moving forward in its usual rhythm. But at the table everything had changed, the structure of the moment no longer defined by control, but by presence, by truth, by the refusal to step away from it. and Amara felt it settle within her, not as victory, not as resolution, but as clarity. The understanding that she no longer needed to wait for permission to be heard, that her voice, once spoken, existed fully, independently, and that realization grounded her in a way she had not expected. Her gaze remained steady, her posture calm, and in that stillness there was a quiet strength that did not need to prove itself, because it simply was, and Ethan, for the first time, saw it, truly saw it, not as defiance, not as disruption, but as something real, something that could not be easily reshaped or dismissed. And that recognition lingered, subtle but undeniable, marking the moment as something neither of them could return from unchanged. The words did not dissolve after they were spoken. They remained in the air with a quiet permanence that neither could ignore, and Ethan felt it settle deeper this time, not just as a challenge to his control, but as something that required a response he did not yet have ready. His gaze held on Amara, no longer searching for weakness, no longer expecting retreat, but measuring something else entirely, something unfamiliar, because the version of her sitting across from him was no longer responding in the ways he had come to rely on, and that absence of predictability forced him into a stillness he was not comfortable with. His fingers rested lightly against the table now, no longer gripping, no longer adjusting, simply still, as if even small movements had lost their usual purpose. "You matter," he said after a pause, the words careful, deliberate. And for a moment, they might have sounded like resolution, like acknowledgement, but something in the tone held back, something incomplete, and Amara heard it immediately, not in the words themselves, but in the space around them, in what they did not carry, because acknowledgement was not just language, it was presence, it was consistency, it was something she had learned to recognize in its absence. Her gaze did not waver, but there was a softness there now, not in surrender, but in understanding, because she could see what he was trying to do, could see the effort to move the moment forward without fully stepping into it, and for a second she considered letting it stand, letting the words pass as enough. But something deeper resisted, something that had already come too far to settle for partial truth. "Then why does it not feel like it?" she asked, her voice quiet, not confrontational, just honest, and the question settled into the space with a weight that shifted the moment once more, because it required something beyond surface response, something beyond controlled language. It required reflection, and Ethan felt it, felt the expectation within the question, the demand not for an answer, but for understanding, and that was not something he could produce as easily. His expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in thought, because for the first time he was being asked to examine something he had always assumed was already understood, something he had never needed to articulate before, and that pause, that hesitation, stretched longer than he intended, revealing more than any immediate response could have. Behind her, Sebastian remained silent, his presence now almost invisible in the moment, not because it had diminished, but because it was no longer the center of attention. The focus had shifted fully to the space between Amara and Ethan, and that was exactly where it needed to be. The intervention had done its work, the balance had changed, and now it was being tested, refined, defined by what came next. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, not in defeat, but in adjustment, because something in the moment required a different approach, something less controlled, less rehearsed. "Because I do not always show it well," he said finally, the words quieter, less polished, and for a brief moment they carried something real, something unguarded, and Amara felt it, felt the difference between this and everything that had come before, not perfect, not complete, but closer to truth, and that difference mattered, not because it resolved everything, but because it acknowledged the existence of something that had previously been denied. Her gaze softened slightly, not in acceptance, but in recognition, because she could see the shift, however small, however tentative, and she understood that change did not arrive fully formed. It arrived in fragments, in moments like this, uncertain, incomplete, but real. "Then show me," she said, her voice steady, and the words carried a different kind of weight, not a demand, not an ultimatum, but an invitation, one that required action rather than explanation, and Ethan absorbed it, the simplicity of it, the clarity, and for a moment he did not respond. Because this was not something he could navigate through words alone, not something he could resolve through tone or structure. It required something else, something he was not entirely sure how to give. And that uncertainty held him still. Across the room, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm. The gentle clink of glasses, the low murmur of conversation, the soft music weaving through it all. But at the table, time seemed to move differently, slower, more deliberate, as if each second carried more weight than the last. And Amara felt it. The gravity of the moment, not overwhelming, but grounding. Because for the first time she was not trying to escape it. She was allowing it to unfold, allowing herself to remain present within it. And that presence, steady and clear, changed everything. Ethan's gaze shifted briefly, not away, but inward, as if he was considering something beyond the immediate exchange, something that extended beyond the table, beyond the evening. And when he looked back at her, there was a subtle difference. Not dramatic, not fully formed, but there, a slight softening. A fraction less control, a trace of something more genuine. "All right," he said quietly, and the words did not carry certainty, but they carried intention, and sometimes that was where change began, not in certainty, but in the willingness to move toward it. And Amara heard it, recognized it, not as resolution, not as closure, but as the beginning of something that had not existed before, something fragile, something uncertain, but something real. And that realization settled into her with a quiet steadiness, because she understood now that the moment had not just been about what had happened, it had been about what could follow. And for the first time she felt that possibility clearly, not as hope, not as expectation, but as something she could choose to step into or step away from. And that choice, more than anything, belonged entirely to her. The agreement did not resolve the moment. It deepened it, because intention without action carried a different kind of weight, one that could not be ignored or easily dismissed, and Ethan felt it settle into place as he held her gaze, no longer searching for control, but for something he had not needed to find before, something less certain, less defined, and that unfamiliarity slowed him in a way nothing else had. His posture remained composed, his voice when he spoke again still measured, but there was a shift beneath it, something quieter, something closer to consideration. "Then let us start now," he said, and the words, though simple, carried a different tone, not directive, not controlling, but tentative, as if he was stepping into unfamiliar ground without the certainty he usually carried. And Amara heard it, felt the difference immediately, not because it was perfect, but because it was present, because it did not push the moment away or reshape it into something easier. It stayed, it engaged, and that alone changed the rhythm of everything. Her breath moved slowly, steady, her shoulders relaxed but not withdrawn, because she was no longer bracing for impact. She was holding space, and that distinction mattered more than anything else. Ethan's gaze flickered briefly to the table, then back to her, as if he was considering where to begin, how to move forward without falling back into patterns that no longer fit. "I did not realize," he started, the words halting, for a fraction of a second before continuing, "that it felt this way for you." And the admission was quiet, almost understated, but it carried something real, something unpolished, and Amara felt it land differently than anything he had said before, not because it fixed anything, but because it acknowledged the gap between his perception and her experience. And that acknowledgement, however small, was something she had not been given before. Her gaze softened slightly, not in acceptance, not in forgiveness, but in recognition, because she could see the effort, the shift, the attempt to step into a space he had previously avoided, and that mattered, even if it was only the beginning. "It has felt this way for a long time," she said, her voice calm, steady, and the words carried no accusation, no sharpness, just truth. And Ethan absorbed it, the length of time implied, the weight of it, and for a moment his expression tightened, not defensively, but thoughtfully, because this was not a single moment, not a misunderstanding that could be resolved quickly. It was something deeper, something that required more than a single response, and that realization settled into him with a quiet gravity. Behind her, Sebastian remained still, his presence now fully removed from the center of the moment, his role complete, his attention still there but unobtrusive, because the balance had shifted, and was now being held by those directly within it. And he understood that stepping in again would only disrupt what had begun to form. The restaurant continued around them. The soft hum of conversation, the gentle clink of glass, the quiet rhythm of movement. But at the table, everything remained focused, contained within the space they had created. Ethan's fingers moved slightly against the table, not gripping, not adjusting, just moving, as if he was grounding himself in the physical world while navigating something less tangible. "I have always thought," he said slowly, choosing each word with care, "that I was providing stability, structure, something reliable." And the words carried a sincerity that was new, unfamiliar, because they were not framed as justification, but as reflection. And Amara listened, truly listened, not preparing to respond, not bracing for correction, just hearing him in a way she had not allowed herself to before, because this was different. This was not control disguised as care. This was an attempt to understand his own perspective, and that distinction mattered. "And I thought," he continued, his voice quieter now, "that meant I was doing things right." And there was a pause then, a space that lingered, not filled immediately, because this time he did not rush to complete the thought, did not rush to protect it from examination. And that pause spoke more than the words themselves. It revealed uncertainty, openness, something that had not been present before. Amara felt it, recognized it, and something within her shifted in response, not softening entirely, not erasing what had come before, but allowing space for something new to exist alongside it. "Providing structure is not the same as making someone feel valued," she said, her voice steady, and the words, though gentle, carried a clarity that reframed the entire conversation, because they separated intention from impact, and Ethan felt it immediately, the distinction settling into place with a quiet weight that he could not ignore. His gaze held on her, not resisting, not deflecting, just taking it in. And for a moment he did not respond, not because he did not have words, but because he was allowing them to settle, to be understood rather than corrected. And that stillness, that willingness to sit within the moment without reshaping it, marked a shift that neither of them had expected. Across the room the evening continued, uninterrupted, as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Because at the table something had moved beyond confrontation, beyond defense, into something quieter, something more deliberate, the beginning of understanding, fragile and incomplete, but real. And Amara felt it, not as resolution, not as closure, but as a possibility she had not considered before, the idea that change, however slow, however uncertain, could begin with moments like this, moments where truth was spoken and not immediately dismissed, moments where presence replaced avoidance. And that realization settled into her with a quiet steadiness, because for the first time, she was not simply enduring the conversation. She was part of shaping where it could go, and that, more than anything, changed what came next. The distinction did not fade after it was spoken. It lingered, settling into the quiet space between them with a depth that neither could easily move past. And Ethan felt it in a way that was unfamiliar, not as something to counter or correct, but as something to consider, something that required him to look beyond the surface of what he had always believed was enough. His gaze remained steady on Amara, but there was a difference now, a shift away from expectation and toward awareness, because for the first time he was not just hearing her words, he was beginning to understand their meaning, and that understanding did not come quickly. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if each realization needed time to take hold. His breath moved out in a controlled exhale, but there was less certainty in it. Now, less of the rigid control that had defined him earlier in the evening. "I see that now," he said quietly, and the words were not defensive, not dismissive, but reflective, and that alone marked a change that could not be ignored. Amara heard it, felt the shift within it, and for a moment she did not respond, not because she did not have something to say, but because she was allowing the moment to exist without rushing it forward, because she had learned that clarity did not need to be forced, it needed space, and that space was something she could now hold without fear. Her posture remained steady, her presence grounded, and in that stillness there was something new, something that had not been there before, a quiet confidence that did not rely on validation but existed on its own. Ethan's fingers moved again, lightly brushing the edge of the table, not out of habit this time, but as if he was anchoring himself in the present, because the conversation had moved beyond familiar ground, and he was navigating it without the usual certainty he relied on. I thought consistency was enough, he continued, his voice measured, slower than before, as if each word required intention, that if I provided stability, if I handled things, if I kept everything structured, that meant I was doing what I was supposed to do. And the words carried a sincerity that was different from anything he had said earlier, not framed as justification, not shaped to regain control, but offered as reflection. And Amara listened, truly listened, because this was not the same conversation they had had countless times before. This was something else, something quieter, something more honest, and that difference mattered, even if it was only the beginning. But I did not ask if it felt right to you, he added after a brief pause, and that pause held weight, because it revealed something deeper than the words themselves. It revealed awareness, the recognition of something that had been missing, and Amara felt it settle into the moment, not as resolution, not as closure, but as a shift, a movement towards something that had not existed before. Her gaze softened slightly, not in surrender, not in acceptance, but in acknowledgement, because she could see the effort, the attempt to step into a space that required vulnerability rather than control, and that was not something she could dismiss. You did not, she said quietly, her voice steady, and the words were not accusatory. They were simply true, and truth, she was beginning to understand, did not need to be sharpened to be heard. It only needed to be clear. Ethan nodded slightly, the movement small but deliberate, as if he was absorbing the confirmation, allowing it to settle rather than pushing against it. And that acceptance, however subtle, marked another shift in the dynamic, because it showed a willingness to remain within the moment rather than redirect it. The soft murmur of the restaurant continued around them, the gentle clink of glass, the low rhythm of conversation. But at the table, everything remained focused, contained within the space they had created, and in that space something new was forming, not fully defined, not yet stable, but present, and Amara could feel it. The difference between being unheard and being considered, and that difference, even in its early form, mattered more than she had expected. Ethan's gaze held on her, not searching for control, not expecting compliance, but observing, learning, and that was something entirely new, something neither of them had experienced before. I do not know how to fix this immediately, he admitted, the words quiet, unpolished, and for a moment they carried a vulnerability that had not been present earlier, because they acknowledged limitation, uncertainty, something he had not allowed himself to express before, and Amara heard it, recognized it. And something within her shifted in response, not softening completely, not forgetting what had brought them here, but allowing space for something different to exist alongside it. I am not asking for immediate, she said, her voice calm, and the words carried a steady clarity that grounded the moment. I am asking for real. And again, the simplicity of it reframed everything, because it removed the pressure of perfection, of instant resolution, and replaced it with something more sustainable, something that could grow, something that could be built over time. And Ethan absorbed it, the distinction settling into place with a quiet weight, because it offered a path forward that did not rely on immediate answers, but on consistent effort. And that was something he could understand, even if he was still learning how to act on it. Behind her, Sebastian remained still, his presence now fully in the background, not withdrawn, but no longer central, because the moment had evolved beyond the need for intervention. It belonged to them now, shaped by their words, their choices, their willingness to remain within it. And that shift marked something significant, something that would not easily be undone. Ethan exhaled again, slower this time, his posture easing just slightly, not in defeat, but in acceptance of the moment as it was, rather than as he had expected it to be. Then I will try, he said, and the words, though simple, carried intention, not certainty, not perfection, but willingness. And that willingness, fragile and untested, settled into the space between them as something new, something that had not existed before this evening. And Amara felt it, not as resolution, not as trust restored, but as a possibility, something she could choose to engage with or step away from. And that choice, more than anything, belonged to her now. And that realization, quiet and steady, marked the true shift of the evening, because for the first time she was not simply responding to what was given. She was deciding what she would accept, what she would build, what she would walk away from. And in that decision, she found something she had not realized she had lost: the quiet certainty that her voice, once claimed, would not be easily set aside again. The words did not promise certainty. They did not erase what had come before, but they remained steady and present, and Amara felt them settle into the space between them with a quiet weight that was different from anything earlier that evening. Because this time it was not about control, not about correction. It was about intention, and intention, she was beginning to understand, was where change either began or quietly failed. Her gaze remained on Ethan, not searching for reassurance, not demanding proof, but observing, allowing the moment to exist without rushing it toward resolution. Because she no longer needed immediate answers. She needed consistency. She needed truth that did not shift depending on the setting, and that clarity grounded her in a way she had not expected. Ethan's posture shifted slightly, not retreating, but settling, as if he had reached a point where resisting the moment required more effort than remaining within it. His fingers rested loosely against the table now, no longer adjusting, no longer seeking control through small movements, just still. And that stillness reflected something deeper, a quiet acknowledgement that the conversation had moved beyond his usual strategies. "I will not pretend this is easy," he said after a pause, his voice calm, measured. But there was a different tone beneath it now, something less polished, something closer to honesty, and Amara heard it, recognized the absence of performance in the words, the lack of careful shaping. And that difference mattered, because it suggested he was no longer speaking to manage the situation, but to understand it. "But I understand that it matters," he added, and the simplicity of the statement carried weight, not because it solved anything, but because it acknowledged the significance of what had been said, and that acknowledgement, however small, was something she had not been given before. Her breath moved slowly, steady, and she allowed the moment to settle, without interrupting it. Because she was no longer trying to control the outcome. She was allowing it to reveal itself, and that shift, subtle but profound, changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. "It does matter," she said quietly, her voice even, not forceful, but clear, and the words carried a steady truth that did not require emphasis, because it simply existed, and Ethan nodded slightly, the movement small, but intentional, as if he was accepting not just the statement, but the weight behind it. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence returning, but it was different now, not tense, not fragile, but reflective, as if the space itself was holding what had been said and allowing it to settle into something more permanent. The soft murmur of the restaurant continued around them, the gentle clink of glasses, the low rhythm of conversation, life moving forward in its usual pattern. But at the table everything remained still, focused, as if time had slowed just enough to allow the moment to be fully felt. Behind her, Sebastian shifted slightly, not stepping forward, not re-entering the conversation, but adjusting his stance as if acknowledging that the moment had reached a point where his presence was no longer needed in the same way. His role had been to interrupt, to create space, and that space now existed on its own, held by the two people at the table, and that was where it needed to remain. Amara felt it. The subtle shift behind her, the quiet indication that she was no longer being shielded, not because she needed protection, but because she no longer required it in the same way. And that realization settled into her with a quiet strength, because it confirmed what she had begun to feel, that her voice was not dependent on external support. It was something she could hold on her own. Ethan's gaze remained steady, not pressing, not searching for control, but present, and that presence, unfamiliar as it was, carried a different kind of weight, one that did not diminish her, one that did not require her to shrink, and that difference, more than anything, changed how the moment felt. "We should not ignore what happened," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, but more certain, as if he was beginning to understand the shape of the conversation, and Amara heard it. The shift toward accountability, the willingness to remain within the moment rather than move away from it, and that mattered. Even if it was only the beginning. "No," she replied, her tone calm, steady. "We should not." And the agreement did not feel like compromise. It felt like alignment, not perfect, not complete, but real, and that reality grounded the moment in something new, something that could be built upon rather than avoided. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing just slightly, not in relief, but in acceptance, because the conversation was no longer something to navigate around. It was something to move through, and that required a different kind of presence, one he was still learning how to hold. "Then we will address it," he said, and the words, though simple, carried a quiet intention that marked another step forward, not a solution, not a promise of change, but a commitment to engagement. And Amara felt it, not as certainty, not as resolution, but as possibility, something that could either grow or fade depending on what followed. And that understanding gave her something she had not felt before, not power over him, but power within herself, the ability to choose how she responded, how she moved forward, whether she remained or stepped away. And that choice, more than anything, defined the moment. The restaurant continued around them, unchanged, unaware of the shift that had taken place at the table. But within that small space, everything had been altered, not dramatically, not visibly, but fundamentally, because something had been spoken, something had been acknowledged, and that could not be undone. Amara felt it settle within her, not as closure, not as an ending, but as a beginning, quiet and steady. The moment when her voice was no longer something she questioned, but something she trusted, and that trust, fragile as it was, marked the true change of the evening, because it did not depend on what Ethan would do next, it depended on what she had already claimed, the simple, undeniable truth that she mattered, and that truth would shape everything that followed. The moment did not end with a resolution, it did not close neatly or fade into something easily forgotten. Instead it lingered, quiet and steady, settling into the space between them as something that would continue long after the evening itself had passed. And Amara felt it in the way her breath moved now, no longer tight, no longer measured by caution, but steady, natural, her body no longer bracing for what might come next, because for the first time, she was not waiting for the moment to shift around her. She was standing within it, fully present, fully aware, and that awareness changed everything. Ethan remained seated across from her, his posture composed, but there was a difference now, subtle yet undeniable. The absence of the rigid control that had defined him earlier replaced by something quieter, something more reflective, his gaze no longer searching for compliance, no longer expecting the familiar patterns to return, but observing, taking in what had changed. And perhaps more importantly, what could not be undone. The silence between them returned. Once more, but it carried a different weight now, not fragile, not tense, but grounded, as if it had been earned rather than imposed. And within that silence there was space, space for thought, for choice, for the next step to be taken deliberately rather than by habit. Amara let her gaze drift for a moment, not away in avoidance, but outward, taking in the soft glow of the restaurant, the quiet movement of servers, the low hum of conversations that continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened, and in a way nothing had, at least not in a way that could be seen. But something had shifted, something internal, something that would not be visible to anyone else at those surrounding tables. And yet it was real, undeniably real. She turned her attention back to Ethan, her expression calm, her presence steady, and in that steadiness there was no longer a question of whether she would be heard, because she had already spoken, already claimed that space, and that could not be taken back. Ethan cleared his throat softly, not out of discomfort, but as if preparing to move forward with intention rather than reaction. "We should decide what comes next," he said, his voice even. But there was something different beneath it now, not directive, not controlling, but collaborative, and that shift, though small, carried meaning, because it placed the next step not solely in his hands, but in both of theirs. And Amara heard it, recognized the change in language, the movement away from assumption toward inclusion, and for a moment she considered it, not as an obligation, but as a choice, because that was what this had become, not a situation she was managing, but a decision she was making, and that distinction grounded her in a way she had not expected. "Yes," she said quietly, her voice steady. "We should." And the agreement did not feel like submission. It felt like participation, something she had not experienced in this dynamic before. Ethan nodded slightly, acknowledging the shared space of the conversation, and for a moment he seemed to consider his next words carefully, as if he understood now that what he said carried a different kind of weight, one that could not be reshaped once spoken. "I am willing to work on this," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried intention, not perfection, not certainty, but a willingness to engage, and Amara heard it, felt the sincerity within it, even if it was still new, still untested, and she allowed herself to acknowledge that, not as resolution, but as possibility, something that could grow or diminish depending on what followed. Her gaze remained steady, her voice when she spoke just as calm as before. "Then we will see," she replied, and the words were not dismissive, not doubtful, but measured, because she understood now that words alone were not enough, that what mattered was what came after, the consistency, the presence, the actions that would either support or contradict what had been said, and that understanding gave her something she had not held before, clarity, not just about him, but about herself, about what she would accept, what she would no longer ignore, and that clarity settled into her with a quiet strength that did not need to be proven. Behind her, Sebastian finally moved, not stepping forward, not interrupting, but stepping away, his presence withdrawing as quietly as it had entered, because his role had been fulfilled, the moment had been interrupted, the space had been created, and now it belonged entirely to them. He did not look back, did not wait for acknowledgement, because he did not need it. His intervention had never been about recognition. It had been about balance, and that balance had been restored in a way that did not depend on him anymore. Amara felt the subtle absence behind her, the quiet shift of his presence leaving, and for a brief moment she considered turning, acknowledging, but she did not, because she understood something now that she had not before, that the strength she had found in this moment was not something given to her. It was something she had claimed, and that realization anchored her in a way that nothing else could. Ethan followed her gaze for a fraction of a second, noticing the absence as well, but he said nothing, because the focus had already shifted back to where it needed to be, between them, within the space they had created. The restaurant continued its quiet rhythm, unchanged, unaware of the shift that had taken place, but at the table everything had moved, not dramatically, not visibly, but fundamentally, and Amara felt it settle within her, not as closure, not as certainty, but as truth, the understanding that her voice, once spoken, would not return to silence, that her presence, once claimed, would not be easily diminished, and that truth would follow her beyond this evening, beyond this table, into whatever came next, because it was no longer dependent on the moment. It was something she carried with her, something she would not set aside again. And in that realization there was a quiet resolution, not of the situation, not of the relationship, but of herself, the understanding that some changes did not come from what others did, but from what she chose to accept, what she chose to hold, what she chose to walk away from if necessary. And that choice, steady and unwavering, marked the true end of the evening, not in what was said, but in what had been claimed, because some voices, once found, do not return to silence, no matter how quiet they may sound.